That was the first thing the mechanic noticed, not the brand stamp on the crankshaft housing, not the serial number prefix that didn't match anything in the Wehrmacht's parts catalog, just the wrench. An American wrench, standard American threading, dropped onto a German engine block inside a captured Soviet T-34 repair depot somewhere east of Kharkov in the winter of 1943, and it fit, perfectly, without adjustment. He set it down, picked it up again, turned it over in his hands the way a man turns over something that shouldn't exist. Around him, his colleagues were finding the same thing: American ball bearings inside German Messerschmitt fighters, American rubber compounds in German tank treads, American precision steel in German artillery shells, not captured, not stolen, not reverse engineered, manufactured, shipped, delivered. The mechanic didn't file a report. There was no protocol for what he had just discovered because officially it wasn't possible. The United States and Nazi Germany were at war, had been since December 1941, and yet the components in his hands told a different story, one that had been arranged, agreed upon, and carefully obscured by men in boardrooms who had decided long before the first shot was fired that the war was also a business transaction. This is not a story about what happened on the battlefield. It's a story about what happened before it, and who paid for both sides. To understand how American industrial components ended up inside German war machinery, you have to go back before the war. Not to the trenches of ideology or the speeches of dictators, but to the balance sheets of corporations, specifically to a legal arrangement called a cartel. A cartel, in the industrial sense of the early 20th century, was not a criminal conspiracy. It was a business strategy, openly practiced, legally protected in most jurisdictions, and widely celebrated in the boardrooms of Standard Oil, General Motors, ITT, and Ford. A cartel allowed competing corporations from different nations to divide global markets, share patents, fix prices, and, critically, continue doing business with each other even when their home governments were at war. Standard Oil of New Jersey, controlled by the Rockefeller family and one of the most powerful corporations in human history, had entered into a formal cartel agreement with IG Farben, the German chemical and industrial conglomerate, in 1929. The agreement was called the JASCO Agreement, later expanded under the name Standard WWII. Under this arrangement, Standard Oil and IG Farben divided the global petroleum and synthetic rubber markets between them. Standard Oil agreed not to enter the synthetic rubber business. IG Farben agreed not to compete with Standard Oil in petroleum outside Germany. The exchange was patents. Specifically, IG Farben gave Standard Oil the patents for tetraethyl lead, the compound that made high-octane aviation fuel possible, and Standard Oil gave IG Farben access to its hydrogenation technology, which allowed Germany to convert coal into synthetic oil and synthetic rubber. Without hydrogenation, Germany could not fuel a mechanized military campaign. It had almost no natural oil reserves. The technology Standard Oil transferred to IG Farben in the 1930s was not incidental to German rearmament. It was the precondition of it. This was not hidden at the time. Standard Oil executives openly defended the arrangement when questioned. They called it sound business. They said international commerce was separate from politics. They said contracts were contracts. What they did not say, what no one in the American corporate establishment wanted said, was that the German military machine that would kill hundreds of thousands of American soldiers was being assembled with American industrial architecture, and that the men responsible for that architecture would face almost no consequences when it was over. General Motors, through its German subsidiary Opel, was manufacturing trucks for the Wehrmacht before and during the war. Ford's German subsidiary produced military vehicles including the Ford 5.8, which became standard Wehrmacht transport. ITT, the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation under the direction of Sosthènes Bahn, maintained direct financial ties with German aviation and communications firms throughout the war, including receiving compensation after the war for damage done to its German factories by Allied bombing. ITT was paid reparations by the American government for the destruction of plants that had been producing for the German military. That sentence is not a misprint. The mechanics east of Kharkov weren't asking these questions. They were just trying to fix the machines in front of them. But the men who had built those machines, and the men who had supplied the components inside them, were already preparing the cover stories that would protect them when the war ended. By 1940, the architecture of industrial collaboration between American corporations and the Third Reich had become a structural feature of German war production, not a loophole, not an anomaly, but a load-bearing wall. IG Farben had become the industrial backbone of the Nazi war economy. It manufactured Zyklon B, the gas used in the extermination camps. It operated a slave labor facility directly adjacent to Auschwitz, a factory complex known as Buna Monowitz, built with concentration camp labor, designed and overseen by IG Farben engineers who walked through the camp selection process and chose which prisoners were fit to work and which were not. The company kept records, meticulous, German records, efficiency reports, productivity graphs, death rates per production cycle. Standard Oil's hydrogenation technology was running inside IG Farben's plants at Leuna and Bleckhammer, producing the synthetic aviation fuel that kept the Luftwaffe airborne. American military intelligence knew this. The U.S. Army Air Forces had detailed reconnaissance photographs of the Luna plant by 1943. The decision about when and whether to bomb it was not made purely on military grounds. It was delayed, debated, and in some cases deliberately avoided, in ways that have never been fully explained. When the bombing did come, it was too late to meaningfully interrupt German fuel production before the final year of the war. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, pushed hard for oil target priority from early 1944 onward. His instinct was correct. But the delay cost time the Allies did not have and lives they could not recover. In the meantime, Standard Oil's cartel arrangement with IG Farben was still technically in effect. The patents were still valid. The licensing fees, suspended during the war, were contractually expected to resume afterward. Standard Oil executives communicated this position to the State Department. They wanted their arrangement protected when peace came. They wanted to be compensated for the years of lost revenue. This was the atmosphere inside which the American war economy operated. Not pure patriotism, not simple national interest, but a layered system of competing loyalties in which corporate continuity was treated as a value comparable to, and sometimes more durable than, national allegiance. The man most responsible for confronting this was not a general. He was a senator. Harry Truman, before he was vice president or president, was chairman of a Senate committee investigating war production fraud and corporate malfeasance. What the Truman Committee found about Standard Oil's relationship with IG Farben was explosive enough that Thurman Arnold, head of the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, filed suit against Standard Oil in 1942 in the middle of the war, accusing the company of having deliberately withheld synthetic rubber technology from the United States government, technology that had been traded away to IG Farben under the cartel agreement. The United States was experiencing a severe rubber shortage in 1942. Tires, medical equipment, gas masks, military seals, and gaskets, all of it depended on rubber that could not be produced domestically because Standard Oil had legally agreed not to develop the synthetic rubber process and had handed the patents to the German side. Standard Oil's president, William Farish, testified before the Truman Committee. He was calm. He was prepared. He admitted the arrangement existed. He said it had been good business practice. He did not use the word treason. Neither, ultimately, did anyone else with the power to prosecute it. Farish died of a heart attack in November 1942 before the legal proceedings advanced. Standard Oil paid a fine. The fine was less than the company earned in a single day of wartime production. The patents issue was resolved through a government licensing arrangement. The cartel agreement was declared void. And then the country returned to fighting a war that was running, in part, on the architecture the cartel had built. The breaking point, if there can be said to be a single one, arrived not in a courtroom or a Senate chamber, but in the specific, physical reality of what the industrial collaboration had made possible. By late 1944, American soldiers were fighting and dying against a German military that should, by any rational industrial analysis, have been incapable of sustained operations. Germany had no natural oil. It had limited rubber. Its steel production was being bombed. Its rail network was under constant attack. And yet the Wehrmacht continued to move. The panzer divisions continued to roll. The Luftwaffe continued to fly. They flew on synthetic fuel produced with American hydrogenation technology. They rolled on synthetic rubber compounds developed in collaboration with American corporate partners. Their communications infrastructure included components manufactured by subsidiaries of American companies. The tanks that killed American soldiers at the Hurtgen Forest and in the Ardennes were maintained with components that fit American tools, because the tolerances had been standardized through cross-Atlantic industrial agreements made before the first shot of the war was fired. The Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive launched by Hitler in December 1944, was Germany's last major strategic gamble. It required massive fuel reserves, which Germany had been secretly stockpiling for months. The offensive failed not because of an intelligence victory or a superior American response, but largely because the fuel ran out. The German armored columns literally stopped moving when the tanks went dry. 14,000 American soldiers were killed in the Bulge. 47,000 were wounded. Nearly 23,000 were captured. The fuel those German tanks were burning had been synthesized using technology that an American company had handed to the German industrial establishment 15 years earlier in exchange for patent licensing rights and market division agreements. No corporate executive went to prison for this. The synthetic fuel plants were eventually bombed into rubble. But the men who had enabled their construction, who had transferred the intellectual and industrial capital that made them possible, returned to their offices, their boards of directors, and their estates. At Nuremberg, 24 IG Farben executives were tried for war crimes. 13 were convicted. The longest sentence was 8 years. Most were out within 3 years. Many returned to senior positions in German industry. Karl Krauk, chairman of IG Farben's supervisory board and a central figure in the Auschwitz slave labor operation, served 4 years and was released in 1950. He resumed business activities. He was never tried again. The American executives who had been their partners were not tried at all. When the war ended, the machinery of narrative control moved faster than the machinery of justice. Standard Oil emerged from the war as one of the most powerful corporations in the world. Its wartime profits were extraordinary. The rubber shortage it had helped create had been resolved through emergency government programs that Standard Oil itself ultimately profited from. The antitrust case against it had been settled for a fine that represented a fraction of a single quarter's earnings. William Farish was dead. The institutional memory of the cartel arrangement was filed in legal archives and largely ignored by a press corps focused on victory. General Motors' Opel subsidiary was rebuilt with Marshall Plan funds. Ford's German operations resumed normal production. ITT received its compensation for bombed factories and continued expanding globally. The corporate continuity that the boardrooms had promised themselves survived the war intact, in ways that the men who fought the war had no reason to know about and no access to change. The U.S. Army's official histories of World War II are extraordinarily detailed on military operations. They are almost entirely silent on the industrial architecture that the enemy used to sustain those operations. The decisions about what to bomb and when and in what sequence are described in tactical and strategic terms. The question of who built what the bombs eventually hit and who in America had helped them build it does not appear in the operational histories. That silence was not accidental. Senate investigators, journalists, and a handful of historians began piecing the record together in the years after the war. Charles Hyam's 1983 book, Trading with the Enemy, drew on declassified documents to reconstruct the corporate relationships in detail. Anthony Sutton's earlier work examined the flow of American technology to both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany across the interwar period. The records existed. The evidence was there. What was absent was the political will and the institutional incentive to draw consequences from it. The Truman Committee's findings were used to improve war production efficiency. They were not used to prosecute the men responsible for the rubber shortage, the technology transfers, or the cartel arrangements that had accelerated German rearmament. Harry Truman understood what the documents showed. He also understood what the political economy of post-war America would and would not tolerate. The companies involved were too large, too interconnected with government contracting, and too necessary for the coming Cold War industrial buildup to be dismantled or seriously prosecuted. Justice, in this case, was a calculation, and the calculation came out in favor of continuity. The survivors, on both sides of the Atlantic, adjusted their accounts. IG Farben was formally dissolved in 1952, but its constituent companies, BASF Bayer Hoechst, reconstituted and became among the most successful corporations in post-war Germany. Their leaders, many of whom had walked the grounds at Buna Monowitz, became respected figures in the German economic miracle. Their American partners resumed normal commercial relations with them. The cartel era was described as a historical aberration, a product of different times and different understandings of corporate responsibility.
That framing was convenient. It was also dishonest.
What the record shows when you read it without the distortions of institutional memory is not complexity. It is clarity. American corporations, operating within legal frameworks their lawyers had carefully constructed, made decisions in the 1920s and 1930s that materially accelerated German military capability. They transferred technology that Germany could not have developed at the same pace independently. They withheld technology from the United States government during a national emergency. They maintained financial relationships with entities that operated slave labor facilities and supplied the infrastructure of genocide. They did this not out of ideological sympathy with Nazism, most of the men involved had no particular politics, but out of the straightforward pursuit of profit and market position. The war that followed killed over 70 million people. The precise causal chain between any individual cartel agreement and any individual death cannot be drawn with mathematical certainty. That is precisely the kind of ambiguity that corporate lawyers spend their careers manufacturing. But the synthetic fuel plants were real, the rubber shortage was real, the ball bearings were real, the wrench that fit the German engine block was real, and the men who created the conditions for all of it went home, collected their dividends, and retired with their reputations intact. The Nuremberg Principles, established after the trials, held that individuals have a legal obligation to refuse participation in crimes against humanity, regardless of national law or superior orders. The principles were written to govern soldiers and government officials. They were never seriously applied to corporate executives. They should have been. And the uncomfortable truth at the center of this history is not that evil men built the Nazi war machine. It's that ordinary businessmen did. Men who attended church, sat on university boards, donated to charities, and told themselves that commerce was immoral, that contracts were separate from consequences, and that what happened on the other side of the ocean was not their responsibility.
They were wrong. They knew they were wrong. Some of them, in private correspondence, said they were wrong. And then they signed the next agreement anyway. The wrench fit because someone had made sure it would.
That someone had a name, an office, and a pension, and history for the most part let him keep it.